Drop your location in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from, because what I'm about to tell you happened right here in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening, and I've been wanting to share it with someone ever since. There were about 130 people in my backyard the night my life almost fell apart. Friends I'd known for 30 years, former colleagues, neighbors who had watched my children grow up through the gap in the fence, to a few people I barely recognized, but who had apparently known my wife Eleanor well enough to bring a covered dish and sign the banner. It was my retirement party. 38 years as a structural engineer, and my daughter had organized the whole thing, right down to the string lights she'd borrowed from the church rec hall, and the custom cake that said Harold, finally free in blue frosting. I remember thinking, standing at the edge of the deck with a glass of sweet tea in my hand, that I had never felt so loved in my entire life. I remember thinking that, and then I remember noticing my son-in-law standing near the drink table, and something about the way he was standing made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I want to give you the full picture before I tell you what I saw that night, because none of it makes sense without understanding what the months before had been like. So let me go back to the beginning, to the slow and quiet way a trap gets built around a person before they even know they're inside it. My daughter's name is Diane. She was 34 years old at the time of my retirement party, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that sounded exactly like her mother's had before Eleanor passed. She married a man named Marcus 6 years ago. I tried to like Marcus. I genuinely tried. He was handsome in a slick kind of way, always dressed like he was about to walk into a meeting, always using the kind of language that sounds confident until you realize nothing specific has been said. He sold commercial real estate, and he was, by his own account, very good at it. Diane loved him completely. That was enough for me, or it was supposed to be. The first sign came about 14 months before my retirement party, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. I had been having some trouble with my memory. Small things, forgetting where I'd put my reading glasses, losing the thread of a conversation, walking into the kitchen, and not remembering what I'd come for. I mentioned it to my doctor, a quiet and thorough man named Dr. Aldridge, who ran some tests and told me what I already suspected, which was that I was 63 years old, and my brain was doing what 63-year-old brains sometimes do. He found nothing alarming. He suggested I reduce stress, sleep more, and cut back on the 2 glasses of bourbon I allowed myself on Friday evenings. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known yet, was that Marcus had been watching my small, forgetful moments very carefully and filing them away for a purpose. He started coming around more. That was the second sign, and again, I missed it completely because I interpreted it generously. I thought he was being a good son-in-law, that Diane had asked him to check in on me since Eleanor had been gone for 2 years and I was living alone in a house with 4 bedrooms and a yard that needed tending. He would stop by on Sunday afternoons, sometimes with Diane, sometimes without her, and we would sit on the back porch and I would make coffee. He always seemed interested in my finances in a way I chalked up to a professional habit. How was my retirement fund looking? Had I thought about the house? About what I planned to do with it? Had I updated my estate documents since Eleanor passed? I answered him honestly because I had nothing to hide. My financial situation was straightforward. The house was paid off. I had a pension from the engineering firm, a healthy 401k, and a savings account that Eleanor and I had been adding to since 1987. Everything was titled jointly to me and Diane, with her as the sole beneficiary of the retirement accounts. I had updated my will the year after Eleanor died. Everything would go to Diane plainly and simply, the way Eleanor and I had always planned. "That's smart, Harold," Marcus said, the 3rd or 4th time we had some version of this conversation. "You've really set Diane up well. She's lucky to have a father who thinks ahead." I didn't notice the way he said it. Not then. The 3rd sign came from my neighbor, a retired postal worker named Glenn, who has lived next door to me for 22 years, and who I consider one of the most reliable people I have ever known. Glenn knocked on my door one Saturday morning in February and stood in my kitchen looking uncomfortable in a way that told me he had something to say that he'd been rehearsing. He told me that Marcus had knocked on his door 2 weeks earlier, on a weekday morning when I was at my monthly engineering alumni breakfast. Glenn said Marcus introduced himself, even though they had met at my Christmas party 3 years running, and then asked Glenn some questions. Had Glenn noticed me seeming confused lately? Had I left the stove on, or left the garage door open? or done anything that seemed out of the ordinary. Had Glenn ever been concerned about my ability to live alone safely? Glenn told Marcus that I seemed perfectly fine to him, the same as always. Marcus nodded and thanked him, and said he was just worried about his father-in-law, being a family man himself, you understand. Glenn waited 2 weeks before telling me because he said he kept going back and forth about whether he was overreacting. I told him he wasn't overreacting. I told him thank you, and I meant it. Then I stood in my kitchen after he left, and I felt something cold and specific settle in my chest. I called Dr. Aldridge that afternoon and made an appointment. Not a regular checkup. I told him what Glenn had told me, and I asked him to run a full cognitive evaluation, thorough and documented, the kind that would hold up if it were ever needed somewhere official. Dr. Aldridge is a careful man. He heard everything I said and asked me several clarifying questions, and then told me to come in Thursday. I scored well, better than well, he said. For a man my age, my cognitive function was above average across every measure they tested. He printed the results and signed them and dated them. I put them in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet next to my will and my deed and Eleanor's death certificate. Then I called my attorney. His name is Robert, and he has been handling my family's legal affairs since before Diane was born. I told him what I suspected. I told him I thought Marcus might be building a case that I was mentally incompetent, and I asked him what that would mean legally and what I could do to protect myself. Robert explained it to me clearly. In the state where I live, a person can be declared legally incompetent through a court proceeding, which requires medical documentation and a judge's ruling. If such a ruling were ever obtained, it would invalidate my existing will and power of attorney documents, and a guardian or conservator could be appointed to manage my affairs. The frightening part, Robert said, was that a spouse or close family member could petition for such a proceeding, and if they had enough manufactured evidence of cognitive decline, and if the right doctor provided a supporting evaluation, the court process could move faster than most people expected. I asked him what Marcus would need to pull something like that off. He would need documentation of incidents, witnesses who had observed concerning behavior, and most critically, he would need a medical professional willing to provide an evaluation supporting incompetency. Without that, the petition would go nowhere. I asked Robert what we could do on our end. He told me to document everything, keep my existing estate documents current and clearly dated, maintain regular contact with Dr. Aldridge, and consider installing security cameras in my home. Not because I expected anyone to break in, because if someone was going to manufacture evidence that I was losing my mind, I wanted a record of what was actually happening inside my house. I put 4 cameras up the following weekend. Glenn helped me. We did it while Diane and Marcus were at a wedding in Savannah. The cameras covered the kitchen, the living room, the hallway leading to my home office, and the back porch. Small and unobtrusive, the kind that look like smoke detectors. Glenn set up the app on my phone so I could check the footage from anywhere. I want to stop here and address something directly, because I imagine some of you are wondering why I didn't simply talk to my daughter. I asked myself that question many times in the months that followed. The answer is complicated, and it pained me more than anything else in this entire story. Diane and I had always been close. After Eleanor died, we became even closer. She called me every few days, came for dinner twice a month, sent me photographs of things that reminded her of her mother. I loved my daughter, and I did not want to believe she was part of whatever Marcus was doing. I told myself, for months, that she didn't know, that he was acting alone, that she was as much a potential victim in this as I was, just in a different way. But I also noticed that when she called, she asked some of the same questions Marcus did. She asked how my memory was, whether I'd had any more episodes, whether I'd thought about maybe having someone come in a few days a week to help with the house. And when I told her I was fine, she said, "I know, Daddy, I just worry." But there was something underneath the words that didn't feel like simple daughter worry. It felt like she was checking a box, documenting a conversation. I didn't confront her. I kept the cameras rolling, and I kept my own counsel, and I waited to understand the full shape of what was happening. The shape became clear enough about 3 months before my retirement party, when Robert called me with information that made my hands go cold. He had been doing some quiet research, he said, and he had discovered that Marcus had consulted with an attorney who specialized in guardianship and conservatorship law. Robert had a contact at that firm who, without sharing any protected information, had confirmed that Marcus was asking questions about the process. He was also looking into real estate holdings, specifically what happened to titled property when the owner was declared incompetent, my house, my retirement accounts, the savings Eleanor and I had built over 40 years. He wasn't waiting for me to die. He wanted it now. He wanted to be appointed as my legal guardian while I was still alive, have me declared unable to manage my own affairs, and take control of everything. With Diane as his wife, that would give him access to all of it. Robert and I spent 3 hours at his office that afternoon going through every document I had. We updated my will. We established a revocable living trust with Robert and Glenn as co-trustees. We drafted a letter that documented my mental fitness and my intentions, signed and notarized, with copies sent to Robert's firm, to Dr. Aldridge's office, and to a second attorney Robert trusted. We also set up a specific provision. In the event that any petition for guardianship or incompetency was filed against me, the trust and will documents would go into effect immediately, removing any incentive for such a proceeding since there would be nothing for a guardian to control. We built a wall. Not a perfect wall, but a solid one. And then I reviewed my camera footage from the previous month. What I found there took me a long time to process. I sat in my kitchen chair for almost an hour after watching it, looking out at the yard where Eleanor had planted the rose bushes that still came back every spring, trying to decide what to feel. Marcus had been in my house alone, twice. On 2 different Sunday afternoons when he had stopped by while Diane was at a baby shower, and I had stepped out briefly to water the garden or check the mail. Each time he had been in the house for less than 4 minutes while I was outside. But the footage showed him moving through my kitchen with purpose, opening a cabinet, taking down the canister where I kept my afternoon coffee, and doing something with it I couldn't see clearly on the small phone screen. I pulled the footage up on my laptop and watched it frame by frame. He was adding something to my coffee grounds. I sat very still for a long time. Then I thought about the headaches I'd had in the past 2 months, the dizziness that had come on a few times in the afternoon, the 2 occasions when I had felt suddenly foggy and slow in the early evening, which I had attributed to not sleeping well. I thought about the appointment where I'd mentioned those symptoms to Dr. Aldridge, and he'd looked slightly puzzled, because nothing in my blood work explained them. I put the coffee canister in a sealed plastic bag and I drove to a laboratory that offers private testing services, and I paid out of pocket to have the contents analyzed. 4 days later, I had the results. There was a mild sedative compound in my coffee grounds. Not enough to be dangerous, not enough to show up, obviously, unless you knew to test for it. Enough to cause exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing. Intermittent fogginess, slowness, the kind of mild confusion that would look, to an outside observer, like the early signs of cognitive decline. I made copies of the lab report and added them to the fireproof safe. I made copies for Robert's file. And then I called the non-emergency police line and spoke to an officer about what to do next. He listened carefully. He told me this kind of thing was more common than people realized. He gave me the name of a detective in the financial crimes unit who had worked elder exploitation cases before. I called her the next day. Her name was Detective Reyes. She was patient and specific, and she asked me to bring everything I had, which I did. She reviewed the camera footage, the lab results, Robert's documentation, the notes from my conversation with Glenn, the timeline I had put together. She sat across from me at a metal table in a small office, and she said, "Mr. Whitfield, what you have here is a credible and documented case. What I'd like to ask you to do, if you're willing, is give us a little more time to build it on our end before we move." I told her I was willing. I told her I had been patient for months, and I could be patient a little longer. I also told her my retirement party was 6 weeks away. She looked at me carefully and asked if I wanted to cancel it. I told her no. I told her I'd earned that party and I intended to have it. She told me that was fair, and she asked me to let her team know the date. In the weeks between that meeting and the party, I did 3 things. First, I continued behaving exactly as I always had with Marcus and Diane, warm and normal, and completely unsuspecting, because the most important thing was that Marcus not change his plans. I ate the food Diane brought me. I drank the coffee Marcus had tampered with on the 2 occasions I had him over, pouring just enough down the drain when he wasn't watching to explain any effects he expected to see. I let him think his plan was working. Second, I replaced all my coffee grounds at home with untampered ones, which I kept in a different canister in a locked cabinet. I wasn't going to consume whatever he'd been adding any more than I had to. I just needed him to believe I still was. Third, I called my son. His name is Daniel. He lives in Colorado, and he and Diane had been somewhat distant since Eleanor's death. Not estranged exactly, but going long stretches without much contact, the way adult siblings sometimes do when the parent who held them together is gone. I called Daniel and I told him everything. It took almost 2 hours on the phone, and there was a long silence at the end of it before he said quietly, "Dad, I'll be there." He flew in 4 days before the party. I want to describe the night of the party to you, in the way it actually felt, which was both entirely ordinary and like standing at the edge of something enormous. The string lights Diane had borrowed from the church were the warm amber kind that make everyone look like they're in a memory. The food was good, the kind of backyard retirement spread that 130 people could navigate without bumping into each other. My former boss gave a short speech about the Henderson Bridge project I'd led in 2009, which made some of the old colleagues laugh and made me feel something genuine in my chest that I hadn't been expecting. I talked to people I hadn't seen in years. I laughed. I meant it. Daniel was there, quieter than usual, stationed near the back fence with a glass of water, and his eyes moving around the yard in a way that I recognized, because it's the way I look at a structure I'm evaluating for stress. Diane was everywhere, refilling things, adjusting things, the way she'd always been at gatherings, her mother's daughter in that particular way. I watched her move through the party and I felt a grief that had nothing to do with Eleanor. Marcus was at the drink table. It was set up on the far end of the deck, a folding table with a floral cloth that Diane had ironed that morning. There were soft drinks, a keg of a local lager, a punch bowl, and a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon that Daniel had brought as a gift, and that I'd set out specifically because I knew Marcus knew it was something I appreciated. Next to the bourbon were 2 glasses that Diane had set aside for the toast, which was scheduled for 8 o'clock, a little over an hour into the party. She had told me about the toast 2 weeks earlier. Marcus was going to give it. I had smiled and said that was very thoughtful. At 7:40, I walked toward the drink table to refresh my sweet tea. Marcus was there alone, his back partially to the room. Most people were clustered near the food on the other side of the yard. I approached from an angle that meant I could see him before he saw me, and what I saw made me stop walking for exactly 2 seconds before I kept moving forward at the same relaxed pace. He had a small vial, glass, dark, the size of a perfume sample. He was holding it over the glass on the left, the one that had been designated as mine, and something was dripping from it into the bourbon. I walked up beside him. "Marcus," I said, in the friendly tone of a man who has just wandered over to refill his sweet tea. He turned fast, and his hand went to his jacket pocket in a motion I was absolutely sure he didn't mean to make. "Harold! Hey! Just getting things ready for the toast." "I see that," I said. I looked at the 2 glasses on the table. The one on the left was mine by position, but in terms of physical appearance, they were identical. "Is that the good bourbon in both of those?" "Yep," he said, and he smiled, and it was the smile of someone who was running a calculation behind it. "I'm glad Daniel brought that bottle," I said. I reached past Marcus with my left hand, as if I was reaching for a napkin, and in the same motion I nudged the glasses. Not dramatically, just enough. A small, casual rearrangement. The glass on the left was now on the right. The glass on the right was now on the left. Marcus watched my hand. He had a 50-50 chance of tracking which glass had moved to which position. And in the moment, in the middle of a party, with 130 people around him, he made a decision. He looked at the glass now on the right, the one that was in the position his glass was supposed to be in, and his posture settled slightly. He thought he still had it straight. He didn't. Daniel found me 3 minutes later, near the rose bushes. I leaned close and said 3 words to him. He nodded once and walked toward the back gate. At 8 o'clock, Diane got everyone's attention with a small bell she'd brought for the occasion. The yard quieted. Marcus picked up the glass on the right and handed me the glass on the left. I held it. I smiled at my daughter. She was looking at me with an expression I read as love, and I chose, for those few minutes, to believe that was all it was. Marcus gave a toast that lasted about 4 minutes. He talked about family, about legacy, about how much Harold had built over his lifetime, and how the people who loved him were going to make sure he was taken care of now that he was entering the next chapter. He said taken care of twice. I noticed both times. He raised his glass. I raised mine. And then Marcus drank his bourbon, in the way that men drink bourbon at toasts, which is to say completely and without hesitation, because no one expects bourbon to be the problem. I set mine down on the railing without drinking it. 13 minutes later, Marcus sat down heavily in a patio chair near the back of the yard. Diane went to him. I saw her face change. I saw her go from party hostess brightness to something alarmed. And then I saw her look up and find me across the yard. And the look on her face in that moment was something I have thought about many times since. It was guilt. The specific guilt of someone who has been caught, not by another person, but by a situation they thought they controlled. Daniel had come back through the gate with Detective Reyes and a uniformed officer. They moved through the party quietly, which at first most people didn't notice, but then the noticing spread in that way it does at gatherings, person by person, a ripple of turned heads and lowered voices. Marcus was confused. That was the word Diane kept using when she spoke to the officers. He's confused. Something is wrong with him. He needs a doctor. She was right that something was wrong with him. What was wrong with him was that he had consumed a substance he had intended for me. He was taken to the hospital by ambulance. The officers also collected the glass he had drunk from, which Detective Reyes had arranged to have tested as part of the ongoing investigation. They also, with a warrant that had been issued 2 days earlier based on the evidence I had brought to Detective Reyes 6 weeks prior, collected his phone and certain documents from the car he'd parked in my driveway. Those documents included a drafted petition for guardianship, a copy of a power of attorney that bore my signature, except that I had not signed it, and an evaluation from a physician I had never met or spoken to, stating that I exhibited signs of moderate cognitive impairment. Diane sat on the back steps of my deck for a long time after the ambulance left. Most of the guests had gone home by then, quietly, the way people leave when a party has become something else. Daniel sat beside her. I sat in the chair across from them. She said she hadn't known about the coffee. She said she hadn't known about the forged power of attorney. She said she had known about the plan to file the guardianship petition because Marcus had presented it to her as something done out of love, out of genuine concern for me, as a protective measure, in case I really was declining. She said she had believed him. She said she had told herself she believed him. I looked at my daughter in the amber light of the string lights she had borrowed from the church and strung up in my yard for my retirement party, and I thought about what 34 years of watching someone grow means when you're sitting across from them at a moment like this. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Diane, did you ever actually think there was something wrong with me?" She looked at the ground. She didn't answer right away. When she did, she said, "I think I wanted there to be, because it was easier than admitting what he was." That answer cost her something to give. I could see it in her face. I kept it somewhere in the part of me that was still her father. The legal proceedings took the better part of 11 months. Marcus was charged with elder financial exploitation, forgery, and unlawful administration of a controlled substance. The guardianship petition was dismissed before it was ever formally filed, since the investigation rendered it moot, and the forged power of attorney was identified and rejected. His attorney tried several different angles of defense. He tried arguing that Marcus had acted out of genuine concern and had been given bad advice. He tried arguing that the glass switch couldn't be proven to have been deliberate, that the presence of the substance could have multiple explanations. Detective Reyes had documented enough that none of those arguments found purchase. He pled guilty to 2 of the 3 charges 14 months after my retirement party. He received probation and community service, which some people in my life thought was not enough, and I understand why they thought that. I spent some time thinking that myself. But the guilty plea meant I never had to sit across from him in a courtroom and watch him try to convince a jury that he had been acting out of love. That was worth something to me. Diane filed for divorce 4 months after the arrest. She told me she had been afraid of Marcus for the last 2 years of their marriage, that he had a way of making her feel responsible for his plans, of framing his schemes as things done for her, for the family, until she couldn't clearly see where his intentions ended and her complicity began. I believed parts of this. I believed all of it on some days, and only parts of it on others. I think that is honest. She is in therapy now. She calls me on Sundays. We have dinner once a month. It is not the same as it was before, and I have stopped expecting it to be. There is a thing that happens when you get past 60 and someone tries to take advantage of the fact. It's not just the betrayal, though the betrayal is real and deep and doesn't go away on a schedule. It's something else, a specific kind of fury at the assumption that age means diminishment, that the years behind you have reduced you somehow, that you can be moved around like a piece on a board because surely by now you've lost the sharpness to notice. I was a structural engineer for 38 years. I have spent my entire professional life assessing what things are made of under pressure, looking for the places where something looks solid but isn't, finding the stress points before they find you. I have spent 38 years understanding that the most dangerous failures are the ones that look fine from the outside until the moment they aren't. I noticed. I want to say that not as a boast, but as a statement of fact, because I think it matters for people watching this, particularly if you are the age I was, or close to it, particularly if you have people around you who have started asking certain kinds of questions, showing a certain kind of concern that feels slightly too specific, too organized, too focused on your finances and your mental clarity. The thing I want you to hear is this: trust that feeling, document everything. Get your estate documents in order with an attorney you chose yourself, not one suggested by someone with an interest. Have a thorough cognitive evaluation done by your own doctor, on your own initiative, and keep the results somewhere safe. And if someone is adding something to your coffee, put a camera in your kitchen. The rose bushes came back again this spring. They do every year, and every year I think Eleanor would be satisfied to know they held. Daniel came to visit for a week in March. He and I repainted the back fence, the two of us working in the early morning before it got warm, not talking much, the way men work together when the work itself is enough. Glenn came over both evenings for dinner, and we sat on the back porch until the dark came all the way in. I have my pension. I have my house. I have Daniel. I have Diane. Imperfectly and carefully, the way you have something that has been through a fracture and been repaired, which is still a way of having it. I retired on a Thursday in December, and I sat in this yard under string lights with people who had known me for decades, and I was, briefly, exactly as happy as I had imagined I would be. That happened. Marcus could not unmake it. The night still happened. Some evenings I sit on the back porch and watch the sun go down past the old oak at the edge of the property, the one Eleanor always said was there before the house was and would be there after, and I feel something that I have decided to call enough. Not happiness exactly, not the easy kind, something more like the satisfaction of a building that has been tested and found to be sound, something more like still standing. That is what I want to leave you with. Whatever is being built around you without your knowledge, whatever pressure is being applied to the places someone assumes are weak, you are allowed to notice. You are allowed to document and prepare and protect yourself without apology and without waiting for someone else to tell you that what you're seeing is real. I am 64 years old and I am still standing. Drop your location in the comments. And if this story reached someone who needed to hear it today, please share it, because I can tell you from experience that the person who needs it most is probably not going to say so.